Hi, I'm Lena Rao. Welcome to our Ask a VC show where we put VCs in the hot seat. This week we have Ethan Kurzweil, partner at Bessemer Venture Partners. Ethan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited.
I'm going to go into your bio just a little bit.
Right.
At Bessemer, you focus on investments in consumer web, mobile, and cloud computing, and you lead Bessemer's roadmap on developer platforms. Some of your investments include Zeus, Reputation.com, Playdom, Piazza, Twilio, SendGrid, Adapt TV, recently acquired, and a number of others. You've been doing this for quite some time. Thanks so much for joining us. I want to go into actually the angle around Twilio, because that's a vastly fast-growing company, and you seem pretty involved with developer relations and the roadmap. What's the biggest change in developer platforms that you've seen over the past few years?
It's been massive, actually. The way that developers build products today, it just is a totally different process than how it resembled than what it used to look like in the past. And that's hitting both startup companies like Twilio and Playdom and Zeus and some of the companies that you mentioned, and enterprises that are doing enterprise development.
What's at the heart of that change?
So I think the whole stack is being reinvented, and I think at the heart of it is this desire for on-demand computing resources when people want to access them in the cloud. You can now go to the top specialist for a particular type of application or a particular type of functionality, rather than having to go and build that functionality yourself in-house. So if you need servers, you go to Amazon Web Services. If you need communications tools, you go to Twilio. If you need email delivered, you go to SendGrid. If you need access to labor force, you go to Crowdflower. If you need payments, you go to Stripe.
Right.
In the past, you had to learn all these competencies yourself, and so it enables more of the world's problems to be addressable by development, which in the past it was just too hard. There was too much complexity to be able to tackle some things, so people didn't do it.
Is there a challenge in having for developers to have to go to all these different APIs and pull and then kind of blend them together within their own applications? What do you think?
Well, it's easier than it used to be before, where developers had to go and learn the programming languages that existed around each piece of functionality. So now you have to learn the APIs, but even that has been abstracted a little bit because there's other developers that will help implement a system in a Twilio. Twilio has a whole independent service group of developers around it that will help you learn their APIs and will build functionalities on top of the Twilio building blocks. So it's been made much more easier. There still is that hurdle,
right, but
it's moved to a more common sort of web service architecture that people are more familiar with, and it's something that once you've learned kind of the abstraction layer, you can easily plug into these different tools.
What would you say is the next big opportunity for a developer-oriented startup? So Twilio's got communications, email, SendGrid, so on and so forth, Stripe or PayPal payments. Where's the next opportunity if you were kind of scouting something out?
Yeah, one big gap we've seen so far has been in security. Much of security has been in the past tools that get installed on premise, scanners and virus checkers and things like that. There certainly is an opportunity, I think, to do security as a service and do it well, and there's a number of companies tracking different vectors on that. Other pieces of functionality that people want to build into their apps, voice recognition,
right,
mapping. There's a whole bunch of different things that will enable people, basically enable the developer to build an app faster, and that's what creates opportunities for these companies.
Well, let's see if your next investment is in one of these new ideas.
Could be.
I want to switch to one of our reader questions. At the early startup level, does a prototype suffice when pitching investors, or do you need to prove with a business model that a startup have already acquired some active users?
I think it depends a lot on what you're doing and where the investor likes to make their investments.
Right, like is it different for consumer versus enterprise?
So for Bessemer, the way we're organized is around particular roadmap areas. And so there's roadmaps we're pursuing, like with augmented reality, where we know there's not a lot of established business models in the space. And so a prototype, some evidence of traction, with users without a business model might be sufficient there. For a more mature SaaS category where there are existing players and it's a competitive market already, we might want to see a little more before we'd be willing to make that investment. So it's highly dependent on the roadmap area and whether it's a roadmap that's early in its development in terms of the market and the maturity of the space versus something that has been established.
So speaking of how you sort of structure your roadmaps, when it comes to companies within the firm that maybe could have synergies across, let's say Twilio with Piazza, or I'm just using that as an example, but how often do you actually put your portfolio companies together from these different areas and roadmaps?
We try to do it as much as we can.
Yeah.
And certainly within the developer area, there's a lot of ways that informally we connected all those companies that you mentioned so they can learn things, and where one company has tackled a problem that benefits another, they can share that. So there's a lot of that stuff happens informally just through our facilitating those interactions. Then we also have various practice areas where we'll have a group of all of our CFOs that get together on a monthly basis or frequent basis to be able to share best practices. We're doing the same thing for CMOs. We're going to do the same thing for growth-oriented product managers, which is becoming a really important discipline. And we're going to try to create those touch points within our portfolio wherever we can. There's a challenge to doing it in a way where people feel like they want to share without giving away any of their secrets, and that's kind of why you have to be delicate about it.
So I'm also curious about your investments in Piazza, which is an education tech company. You guys were early on backed that company. What did you think about that? I mean, education tech now is like this huge next opportunity. I feel like every VC is talking about it. But you seem to kind of catch on to that a little earlier. What did you see in that particular startup that had tremendous potential?
Absolutely. I think what Piazza specifically, first there was the trend you mentioned, that ed tech, there needs to be a reinventing of all of the technology that we use around education. And we made a number of investments on that theme. Piazza specifically had succeeded in getting viral organic adoption within universities without having to go and sell something to a university IT department. Pooja had figured out how to create such a compelling product that it's spread on its own through word of mouth and through some lightweight invitation mechanics, such that she's got thousands of schools and tens of thousands of classes standardizing their whole teaching around Piazza, which is pretty unique. I haven't seen that in any other companies. We also invested in a company recently, Instructure, that has an LMS system that's sold to universities, and they had cracked a different way of getting that product adopted.
What's the challenge in the ed tech market? Like with health, there's a lot of regulatory issues with whether that be with legal sort of ramifications, or also some of the issues around insurance companies and that whole navigating that process. But with ed tech, what are the roadblocks there?
It's somewhat similar. It's somewhat analogous to health. For instance, one of the big roadblocks in education has been the university IT departments, which it's not the most well-funded area of universities, and they're not necessarily on the cutting edge of adopting new technologies. It's a reason why something like Piazza makes sense, because you can go in through the professors directly. There's also a lot of regulations. There's companies there's one company in particular that has kind of a very dominant monopolistic position in the space.
I think I know that company.
Probably know who I'm referring to, and trying to compete with them has its unique set of challenges. And then it's also the case that the education market is not some siloed thing that's disconnected from all the consumer tools that we're using already. And so, things like Facebook have made a tremendous difference in terms of how education works, and education tools have popped up on Facebook. Social gaming tools have education purposes too. So it's a hard space to actually crack the code on, but once you do, there's a lot of opportunity there.
Well, good advice for any entrepreneurs in that space. Thank you so much, Ethan, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.